Alright, and we're back. Philosophy Roulette number 53, it looks like. So, here we go. Let's see what we got today. We've got... No, I feel like something straightforward today. Let's just go to Thought Journal, see if there's anything new. Keep it short, keep it simple. Thought, a journal of philosophy. How to build a thought. Oh, I think I did this one. That's too bad. I was like, got all excited for a second. Let's see. I did a bunch of these already. Let's see. Anything else that I can get? Circularity of reading of Frege's indefinability argument. Junior Kim, let's see if it is here. This just looks like the different stuff. Other things that this fellow has written. That is unfortunate. Let's see. Modal rationality, the fundamental scrutiny. This might be something on bullshit. Did I see this one yet? Probably going over stuff I already know I can't find. So sad. Let's see what else we got. Done the sideways music. Oh, I didn't do what it takes to be hunky. I was like, one of these things on like modal or whatever these things are. But we'll find out what sort of hunkiness they're talking about. Oh, but if I can't download it, I can't do it. The accident of logical constants. Oh, that's right. Am I going to sit around reading? Yeah, I can't read too much logic, so I don't want to bother with that. Yeah, same with these. Well, let's see. Give Tristan Haze. And Tristan Haze, I think I mentioned last time when I didn't do this one last time, he's one of the funnier philosophy blogs out there. I wish he would publish more on it. Okay, so let's just see how if it's overly too many formulas, I can't read it, but let's look real quick. Oh, well, that's not bad. Okay, so we're gonna do this. And if you are joining me live, you can always get the link here if you're coming a little late by typing !_ paper in the chat. Cool. Okay, and here we go. Introduction. First order logic has greater scope than propositional logic. It recognizes all valid forms that propositional logic recognizes and more besides. But what determines the scope of a logic? Some have said that the scope of a logic is determined by which terms are counted as logical constants. Some examples. The choice of logical constants determines which sentences are counted as logical truths. It is clear that an answer to the question, what is a logical constant, would provide us the means to answer the question, what are the limits of logic? Philosophically, my goal has been to find out what distinguishes logic from non-logical terms, and on this basis, determine the scope of core logic. At least under most views, logic is concerned only with certain kinds of correct arguments, and in fact only with arguments whose correctness is due to their particular properties of expressions in a certain set. In the most general, least theory-laden conception of it that seems possible, The problem of logical constants is the problem of demarcating in some principle-based, non-arbitrary looking way the set of expressions that logic should deal with as directly responsible for the logical correctness of arguments. Some have even suggested that we need logical terms in order to do logic at all. For if no terms are designated as logical constants, logic will lose the generality that comes with the ability to isolate and study argument forms. All parties agree that permitting all expressions to have variable interpretations makes formal treatments of validity impossible, since no argument form would preserve truth under all interpretations of logical constants, and all agree that permitting no expression to have variable interpretations does not allow for multiple instances of a given logical form, thus precluding the study of formal logic. Hence, all agree on the need for logically relevant constants. But there are logically correct, that is, formally valid arguments whose logical correctness does not depend on the meanings of logical terms. Which argument forms are countenanced in a logical theory does not depend on which, if any, logical terms are present in the language of the theory. And the problem of scope of a logic, I wonder why I did, I don't know why I parenthesized the A logic, does not reduce the problem of demarcating the logical terms. Yeah, these points have been obscured by certain historical developments. For instance, the popular Bolzano-Tarski explication of logical consequence, which in effect takes a language as given and then raises the issue of which expressions in that language count as logical, tends to obscure the fact that the fact that decisions affecting the scope of a logic may have already been made by the time the language has been determined. Yes, that's definitely an issue. Scope. It's one of the first things, like, what are you talking about? And if you have already selected the language, you're going to already, what that language talks about includes what it's going to range over, which is scope. Also, it happens to be the case that in most common presentations of the common types of logic, classical, propositional, and first-order logic, all valid forms except the identity inference from A infer A involve logical terms. There are deeper but still contingent reasons for logical terms playing such a prominent role in the study of logic, having to do with the way human beings are trained or constituted. As Ramsey noted long ago, we might, for instance, express negation not by inserting a word not, but by writing what we negate upside down. Such a symbolism is only inconvenient because we are not trained to perceive complicated symmetry about a horizontal axis. I mean, they used to do other things, like they'd put bars above stuff. So, I mean, I'm not sure. We're trained to perceive lots of complicated things visually. It's just silly to do it for something as simple as negation, or as stating negation, because we normally, in the way we speak, I don't know if it's a question of training. I don't know if I agree with this point. I mean, we are trained to perceive complicated symmetry. That's actually maybe one of our #1 skills as humans. Anyway. But maybe that's why it'd be so weird by flipping things to do it that way. Gil Sagi and Alexandra Zink are two recent authors who have argued that the scope of a logic is not always a matter of logical terms. Sagi, 2014, develops a formal theory of semantic constraints on a language designed to offer a way of theorizing about logical form more general and flexible than focusing on the issue of logical versus extra-logical terms. Zink notes, in passing really, that propositional logic can be done without logical terms, and that therefore the logical extra-logical distinction outruns the distinction between logical and extra-logical terms. However, we will see that Zink treats this as little more than a strictly speaking sort of point, and in my view at least, pulls back from appreciating it in its full significance. It is the purpose of this paper to further develop these insights. First, I extend Zink's technique for avoiding logical terms in propositional logic to first-order logic with identity. Second, I consider the case of adverbs, which highlights the importance of not letting the issue of logical termhood hog the limelight by making it clear that it is not even contingently the case that issues about a logic scope generally appear as issues about logical termhood. Zink 2018 notes that we can do propositional logic without having any terms for truth functions. It is well known that there are two binary connectives, the Sheffer stroke and the per stagger, both of which are functionally complete all by themselves. Zink points out that if we only have one connective, we might as well omit it. To form a truth functional compound, we could just write two sentences next to each other, using brackets as usual for scope distinctions, she writes. In such a language, there are no logical constants in the narrow sense. That is, there are no elements of the alphabet which are classified as logical. The only logical notion there is not represented by a sign of the alphabet, but by a particular way the terms are arranged. Well, it's geometric. It's a geometric arrangement. I mean, it's like saying the negative space isn't a logical term, but you've got negative space versus a positive mark. I'm not exactly sure about that. Yeah, lest it be a thought that this is a trick which stops working in a less basic setting, it is worth noting that we do not need to stop at propositional logic. We can do without much trouble devise a language in which the full expressive power of standard first-order logic, which is free of logical terms. Contemporary presentations of first-order logic typically involve two or three kinds of logical terms: propositional connectives, one or two quantifier symbols, and perhaps an identity predicate. As we just saw, we don't need propositional connectives. Secondly, we don't need a special quantifier symbol either. We may take universal quantification as basic and use the old-fashioned parentheses style notation. For example, instead of for all x, f of x, just write just blank parentheses with nothing in front of it, f of x. Again, this just seems to be abusing our everyday way of writing things to just take for granted what we're talking about. The geometry of the written word is not like trivial, so I'm a little confused by the strategy. Like, because a blank, it's like you're reading into the spacing all the logical terms, but then it's like the negative space is doing the work of the positive mark, but it's still something of a specific shape. Thirdly, we may express identity by simply putting two terms together and adding brackets. Yeah, it's like, how many times you want to use brackets? I mean, okay. They seem candidates for a formal specification of the language just sketched. Finally, in case anyone is tempted to count brackets as logical terms on the grounds that they are symbols whose significance is in some sense the same in all interpretations of logical language, note that brackets may be avoided in a two-dimensional notation. Instead of writing a left bracket, move up, and instead of writing a right bracket, move down. The strategy of Polish notation, another well-known means of avoiding brackets, is unavailable in the present setting, since we don't have a connective to signal the beginning of our truth functional compounds. Similar two-dimensional techniques may be employed to permit more truth functions and the existential quantifier to be taken as basic if desired. Yeah, I'm a little skeptical so far. I'm not usually this skeptical on things, but we'll see where this is going. The eliminability of a symbol for identity is, I think, particularly instructive, since it suggests that at least some issues about logic's scope could be quite easily have arisen in a guise other than of an issue about logical termhood. People have differed over whether the theory of identity is part of logic proper, with some maintaining that while first-order logic without identity is pure logic, first-order logic with identity is a first-order logical theory about a particular subject matter, namely identity. Since we typically represent identity claims in formal language using a special symbol, equal sign, this issue typically appears as an issue about logical termhood. But this could quite easily have been different. In English, we often express identity claims using is. And just as the is of predication disappears upon logical regimentation, so too would the is of identity if we did things slightly differently as described above. The issue of whether identity falls under logic scope then appears as an issue about whether to countenance a particular form of well-formed formulas. Okay, but this is a good question about where identity falls, but that it could be done away with in logic is, arguable, as the author says. Now, what does all this show? About the propositional logic case, Zink draws the following moral. We are unable to classify a term as logical in a case like this, but This does not mean that there are no logical constants in a wider sense in such a language. The language just described, a grammatical construction rule, has to be characterized as logical. Strictly speaking, the problem of logical constants should therefore not be understood as restricted to drawing a line between the logical and non-logical terms of the alphabet. Yes, I agree with that sentiment. I take the point that if by logical constants we just mean something like logical features of the language, then none of what we've above shown is that we don't need these. But I think we should demur from extending the meaning of logical constants in this way. In this connection, it is interesting to note that although the phrase logical constants, the emphasis for present purpose is really on the logical part, logical constants as opposed to extra logical ones. The connotation of the phrase easily shifts so that the emphasis falls on constants, logical constants as opposed to expressions in logical language whose meanings vary. This shift also fits with the fact that constant tends to be used in logic nowadays only for individual constants and not in a way that would naturally cover connectives or quantifier symbols. Indeed, this terminology of logical constants, euphonious and entrenched as it may be, has arguably been outdated ever since the Tractatus, where, while so influentially rethinking the nature of formal logic, Wittgenstein declares that the so-called logical constants are not representatives. Yeah, I mean, of course, the idea that there's constants in other subjects, not logic. I mean, clearly math, but probably lots of other places too. So yeah, the more philosophical question is what is logical, but I'm still a little bit I'm a little uncertain of where we're going here. Okay. Terminology aside, there's a deeper point that needs to be made here. Above, we eliminated symbols which in the development of logical theories normally and naturally get used, although in the case of identity it seems as though it could have easily gone either way, in favor of an alternative way of accomplishing the same thing. This invites the thought that logic, while technically it could be done without logical terms, is for us humans a matter of studying how our logical terms work. Something like this may be behind what Zinke goes on to say after the above quoted passage. While it is important to keep this in mind, I will nevertheless continue to speak of the problem of logical constants and say that it focuses on drawing and justifying the line of demarcation between the logical and non-logical terms. This not only helps keep the discussion simple, it is also legitimate as far as one is solely concerned with the natural language where we indeed have terms representing the logical notions. In my view, this is an unfortunate event, and the final thought above about how things in natural language is importantly misguided. A good way to see this is to consider the case of adverbs. Consider the following natural language arguments. Deletion. Socrates is running quickly. Therefore, Socrates is running. Addition. Socrates is not running. Therefore, Socrates is not running quickly. Both arguments are necessarily truth-preserving. Furthermore, they seem to be a clear sense in which they are both necessarily truth-preserving in virtue of their forms. I'm not sure what the understanding of form is here. Really, like, what is truth-preserving in the nature of their forms? Because that depends on how you break up the sentences to begin with, which is where you put the parentheses. But since that's at issue here, I'm not sure. Their being necessarily truth-preserving does not turn on the specific meaning of running and quickly, but rather has to do with the fact that quickly belongs to a certain category of expressions, factive or intersective adverbs, all members of which can be deleted from atomic statements and added to negated atomic statements while preserving truth, among other inferential behaviors such as compounding and permutation. Indeed, such arguments are naturally formalized by augmenting first-order logic with extra category of expressions so that they get translated as follows. RSQ, therefore RS, not RS, therefore not RSQ. Yeah, but there's a lot of grammar built into this stuff. You have to know where these things come and how to like tack them on. So it's like so you can do this formulaically right here, but it's not so clear that like in natural language what's going on. You already have to know what you're talking about to properly read this off the natural language or put it into the logic. I mean, things like donkey sentences make it very hard to do, just read it off. And so like to know what the scope issues are either. So the fact that we've picked adverbs here as something that's non-problematic doesn't mean that there isn't a lot going on perhaps in the background logically. Okay, these arguments may then be determined to be necessarily truth-preserving in virtue of their forms. Maybe. Some may think that logic should countenance such adverbs involving valid forms, while others maintain either that the natural language arguments which motivate such a view are not formally valid after all, or that such arguments should be analyzed or regimented into non-adverb involving forms. Wait, let me reread this again. Okay, I am not taking a stand on this issue. The point here is we have an issue about the scope of logic, about the range of valid forms it should countenance, which does not turn on which expressions are counted as logical constants. Rather, the issue in this case naturally occurs at the level of which grammatical categories and modes of composition should be included in a logic. Yeah, this is the problem here. You've got just calling something grammatical categories doesn't mean there isn't logic built into that sort of stuff. And so you've got a nasty problem here of what came first. Is it the grammatical category or is it the logic? And and if you assume that the grammatical categories are somehow innocent, I think that's a bad assumption. Okay, but maybe I'm being grumpy again, and this is not really a problem, so let's move on. We are now in a position to see what might be wrong with Zinke's thought. While strictly speaking, it isn't generally correct to speak, nevertheless, as if the bounds of logic were a matter of this distinction between logical and extra-logical terms is legitimate as far as one is solely concerned with natural language, where we indeed have terms representing the logical notions. The talk of logical notions here rather stacks the deck against a case like that of adverbs, resulting in a subtle non sequitur. For aspects of logic that are naturally dealt with using logical terms, it is natural enough to talk of notions, the notion of identity, the notion of all, the notion of or, and so on. But with arguments like addition and deletion above, there is no analogous use of notions which fits very well as a way of talking about what is responsible for their apparent validity. Well, the grammar has logical properties too, so this is the problem. You're not going to get identity or all as that, but the grammar may also reflect part of the logic, and that is why we can often so easily read logic off the natural language, except in cases like donkey sentences. It doesn't always work, but it's because there is structural analogies. There is no analogous use of notions. No, there's analogous grammar structures. All right. To sum up, the ubiquity of logical terms and the valid forms of standard logical theories is not an essential feature of formal logic. The work done by logical terms is in some logical languages logical languages, in others may be. Can't read this sentence. The work done by logical terms in some logical languages may in others be taken over by specific aspects of syntax, categories of symbol, modes of composition of symbols, or even modes of appearance of symbols, italicization, writing upside down, or in different colors, etc. In the case of identity, it seems reasonable to think that this could quite easily have gone either way. Furthermore, the issue of whether a logic should accommodate a case like that of adverbs naturally occurs in such a way that no question arises about whether certain logical terms should be countenanced. Accordingly, philosophers of logic should be aware of attaching too much of the wrong kind of importance to the notion of logical terms. Okay. Oh, so that's it. And then there's an appendix. Oh, so we're going to look at that first word of logic without logical terms. So let's see. We've got some names, A, B, C to T. If we need more, just use subscripts. Yeah, you can have as many names as you want. Variables. And okay, so that goes from X, Y, and Z, and subscript. Predicates. Super number of argument places. Okay. So we got one of those, and then we got brackets with a comma there. Definition of a term. Names are terms, variable are terms, nothing else is a term. Well-formed formulas. Okay. Where Pn is an n-place predicate and T1 to Tn are terms, the following is a well-formed formula. The predicate given the terms in this stuff with underlining under everything. A well-formed formula of this kind is called an atomic well-formed formula, where alpha and beta are well-formed formulas, x is a variable, and t and u are terms. Following are well-formed formulas. Okay, so we've got alpha, beta, t, u. What are t and u terms? I don't know what and for all x, alpha. Nothing else is a well-formed formula. So what is this? Is this conjunction? Might be. A model may be thought of consisting of a domain D, mapping from names to members of their D, their reference, and mapping from n-place predicates, a possibly empty set of n tuples of predicate distinction. Truth in a model M may then be defined as following. For the quantificational case, we use... Oh, that's right, we're doing Sheffer structs. You don't need other connectors. Okay. For the quantificational case, we use alpha bracket x to stand for arbitrary well-formed form with no free occurrence of any variable other than x, and alpha ax to stand for the well-formed formula resulting from alpha x by replacing the free with a, the name a. Okay, let's see. Let's just see if I'm going to read this. This is it for the paper. A well-formed formula Pn to a1 to an, where Pn is an n-place predicate for a1 to an, named is true in M if and only if the ordered n tuple consisting of the reference of M in a1 through an in that order is in the extension of Pn. A well-formed formula NO, where N and O are names, is true if and only if M and O have the same reference. Oh, so this is identity. Okay. A well-formed formula. Oh, these are okay. So this is the identity of when these are names. A well-formed formula alpha beta, where A and B are well-formed formulas, is true in alpha beta if and no alpha and beta are both false in M. So this is the Sheffer stroke. Well-formed formula for all x, ax is true for every object M. Okay, normal replacement rules. Okay, so yes, you can do this without logical constants, but you are abusing the grammar, in my opinion, and this. You know, going back to Wittgenstein, there's one of my favorite passages. I have a little soft spot in my heart for diagrams in philosophy. There are not so many diagrams in philosophy. Philosophy does not tend to be diagram heavy. It has a lot of formulas, but you don't get so many pictures. The lines, the arrow lines in philosophical investigations, we've got like a bunch of arrows going across a page, and then one of them is just like going like completely across all the other ones. We have a very natural tendency to read things. I mean, if you're in a country that has a language that goes right to left, or mine goes left to right, we have a very natural like training, as was said earlier, that you can move. You have a way of like lining things up in this world. But there's no reason why we have to line things up. We could always line things up where everything, except for the last one and the first one, they connect up, but everything else goes straight across. Why do we do this? That's a different problem. But this is a sort of thing. It's like the way we understand how things are even presented to us has like a structure that matters. And so it looks like by pulling out the logical terms, yes, you can of course do that, but you are building that structure into everything else. Now, does the paper make a nice point that you don't actually need to attaching the wrong kind of importance to the logical terms? Sure, that's a nice sentiment, but like, it just seems like, well, the reason people focus on them because, well, they're there on the page. But if you take them out, it's just building more into like the superstructure of the page, and I'm not sure like how. I'm not buying this argument, to tell you the truth. At the moment, I'm being grumpy, but we'll see. What was the quote from Russell when he wrote to if you go get yourselves hands on the letter Russell sent to Frege when he found the his paradox, the famous paradox, which we have that letter, or something like that. He starts off. He says, "Look, I haven't had enough time to dedicate to your work until recently." Basically, I think it came down to like Frege's notation with those like lines and little hooks and like brackets, the visual quantification. It's like, that's really hard to use. We don't do that sort of thing. And so it's like when you start building stuff out, it really makes a difference in how we understand stuff. Now, is it what Ramsey said, quoted here in the beginning, that we're not trained to recognize like complicated forms? No, we are set to be very complicated symmetries. Like, that's what it is to be human. But there's a good. This is the exact problem. What are we good at, and why is it that logic has come to have symbols like the way it does for logical constants? Okay, that's enough of me griping about logic. This is why I was excited to read this paper, because I thought I might actually have something, because a lot of times I have nothing to say about these things, or nothing I think is particularly clever to say, but I actually disagree with this one, so that's a good paper. Give me something to disagree with. I quite like that. I hope you enjoy this. Everyone stay safe out there, and I'll just probably be back tomorrow because I'm in New York and there's nowhere to go and nothing else to do. Stay safe, folks. Bye.